Identifies self by name. Identifies the resident by name. Washes hands. Explains the procedure to the resident, speaking clearly, slowly, and directly. Maintains face-to-face contact whenever possible. Provides privacy. Adjusts the bed to a safe level. Locks the bed wheels. Positions the resident in a supine position. Exercises are done by the resident with some assistance and support. The resident uses a stronger arm or leg to move weaker joints of a limb. Has the resident repeat each exercise at least 3 times. Performs the following movements properly. For the shoulder, extension, flexion, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. For the shoulder, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. For the elbow, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Pronation, supination, supination, pronation, supination, pronation, supination, pronation. And for the wrist, flexion, dorsiflexion, dorsiflexion, flexion, dorsiflexion, flexion, dorsiflexion, flexion, dorsiflexion, flexion. Radial flexion, ulnar flexion, radial flexion, ulnar flexion, radial flexion, ulnar flexion, radial flexion, ulnar flexion. And for the thumb, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Opposition,
opposition, opposition.
Apposition. Apposition. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. And for the fingers, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. And for the hip, abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Internal rotation, external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. And for the knees, flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. Ankles, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion, plantar. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Supination, pronation. Pronation. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. For the toes, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Abduction, adduction. Repeat exercises on the other side. Returns the resident to a comfortable position and covers as appropriate. Returns the bed to the lowest position. Places the call light within the resident's reach. Washes hands. Documents the procedure. Notes any decrease in range of motion or any pain experienced by the resident. Notifies the nurse if increased stiffness is noted.